Okay, everybody, thanks for coming. And I'm very pleased to introduce Saad, who is a professor at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. And God is one of the very first people to apply evolutionary thinking to the field of consumer behavior and marketing. He's a true pioneer. Along the way, he has also become a champion for evolutionary psychology, the study of psychology from an evolutionary perspective in general terms. This is a controversial topic, and God addresses it with great energy and good humor. So he's really one of my favorite people. And so, and he'll tell you his story, basically, about how he adopted an evolutionary perspective. But I am certain that you will be both entertained and informed by God's talk. So I'll just put this in your pocket and
Can you hear me well? Is this good? Okay, thank you very much, David, for the very generous words. Great to be here. I'll show you in a second the first time that I was here in 2005 with noticeably more black hair at the time. So, as David said, I'm proud to report, and with some humility, that I founded this field of evolutionary consumption. But let me tell you a bit about how it came to be that I was bitten by the evolutionary bug. So in my first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell back in 1990, I took an advanced social psychology course with this gentleman, Professor Dennis Regan, just down the road from here. And halfway through the semester, this wasn't an evolutionary course, it was a social psychology course, but halfway through the semester, he assigned a book called Homicide, which I recommend for everybody in this room to read if you haven't read it already. And in the book, Daly and Wilson, two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, apply evolutionary principles to explain universal patterns of criminality. So what are some forces that lead to certain forms of crimes that occur in exactly the same way across disparate cultures and time periods? And so the elegance of that framework was so awe-inspiring that that's when I was originally bitten with the evolutionary bug. And then I decided that I would take this framework and apply it to study consumer behavior. So now all the memories, going back to memories. So the picture up there is me about to, I was about to speak in 2005, and David's there about to introduce me. As you could see, much, much more black hair. And then the two photos at the below is my reciprocating David's invitation to come to Concordia in 2009. I was slightly heavier, so I'm glad that I've lost a bit of weight. And this is last year, 24 evolutionists were taken prisoner by the Max Planck Society in this gorgeous Bavarian castle, where we sat around this U-shaped table for several days and discussed ways by which evolution and economics could be married in a meaningful way. That was a great time. And so David and I go back quite a long time, and I'm very honored to have him as a friend and colleague. Here's a quote. I love to use this quote. I suspect that many of the people in this room don't have to be preached about the importance of biology to understanding human affairs. But this is a fantastic quote because it's from two of the prominent scientists of the 20th century. This is E.O. Wilson, the famous evolutionary biologist, and James Watson, Nobel Prize winner, chatting on the Charlie Rose show back in 2005. So let me just quote you the exact discussion. So psychologists, most of the practicing psychologists and theoretical psychologists, and the vast majority of the social sciences who really determine a lot of the intellect that goes into our policies, and our philosophies, our political philosophies, have no connection at all to their true nature of humanity or what human nature is at a biological level. This is still a huge gap, and I believe that we will start to fill that in a way that will be useful in years immediately ahead. To which Watson retorts, I see the past century was the coming together of chemistry and biology. This century will be the coming together of psychology and biology. And this is exactly what I do. I look at consumer psychology from a biological and evolutionary lens. Let me skip this one. So are consumers born or made? In a sense, that's a false question, because for many traits, we are in an inextricable mix of both. But it might surprise you to know that most social scientists, and certainly consumer psychologists, view consumers very much as being made. Consumers are a product of their environments, of their culture, of socialization. They don't recognize that consumers are also biological beings that are within the purview of evolutionary forces. And so Wilson famously said that the genes hold culture on a leash, to which I slightly tweak that and say the genes hold consumer behavior on a leash. Yes, culture matters. Yes, the environment matters. But surely our biology matters as well. So speaking of this idea of is something learned or innate, let me give you an example of how we might be able to dismantle, or if you'd like, decouple some of the learning and the biology of a phenomenon. So toy preferences is a classic example, because social constructivists like to argue that toy preferences, or the socialization of toy preferences, is what socializes us into our gender roles. Little boys are taught to play aggressively with blue trucks. Little girls are taught to play in a nurturing way with pink dolls, and that starts a cascade of, patriarchal socialization. Well, let's see if that premise holds up to scrutiny. So let me just mention a few findings that I've culled from many different sources to show you how we might be able to create sort of a cumulative evidence that might negate that premise. So if you look at children who are in the pre-socialization stage, these are children who cognitively, in terms of their cognitive development, don't yet have the capacity to be socialized. So by definition, they couldn't have learned this. They exhibit sex-specific toy preferences. They usually do these studies with gaze, how long a little boy or a little girl will gaze at a truck or at a doll. So already that suggests that there might be something, ontogenetically speaking, that is happening in the pre-socialization stage. There's a disorder called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. It's an endocrinological disorder. So for example, if a little girl suffers from this disorder, she becomes very masculinized, both in her morphology, in her physical features, but also in her behaviors. Well, little girls who suffer from this disorder, this endocrinological disorder, what do you think happens to their toy preferences? They become much more masculinized, like those of a little boy. So that, again, suggests that there might be some hormonal factors that come into play in terms of predicting our toy preferences. Boys' digit ratios, now everybody will start looking at their fingers. Your digit ratios is a putative marker of how much exposure to androgens you've had in utero. So the greater the difference between the index and the ring finger, the more masculinized you are. The more these are equal, the less masculinized you are. And so they've done studies where now I'm going to lose them for a few seconds while everybody looks at their, okay, we're done with your fingers. So they've looked at these studies where they've measured little boys' digit ratios, and the more masculinized their digit ratios are, the more their play choices are sex-specific towards being male. Similar studies have been done where you measure circulating hormones starting at age 7 days after birth, until 6 months old, and circulating levels of testosterone of these young children then predict their likelihood of playing with trains and trucks and dolls and so on. If that's not convincing enough, you could do a comparative psychology approach where you look across species. You take rhesus and vervet monkeys. This is my daughter when she was very young, Luna. And rhesus and vervet monkey infants display the same sex specificity as human infants. So we're starting to pick up a lot of evidence that suggests that it's not quite such an easy story as, oh, it's just due to random socialization. Now, if that still didn't convince you, let me give you a few more. Take Sweden. Oh, no, Sweden, you failed us. Sweden is a model of gender egalitarianism. On Hofstede is a famous cultural psychologist. He's got a measure that captures how gender-neutral a society is, how masculine or feminine it is. Out of 50 countries, Sweden is the most feminine and most gender-neutral. So if there was ever a country, a culture, where you might see the sex specificity not happen, it would be Sweden. Well, guess what? This gentleman did a study on 40,000 toys of boys and girls, and maybe to his great disappointment, he found that Sweden was no different in its sex specificity of toy preferences. And if that's not enough, you could do studies. I won't point to all of these, but these are all different, very exotic cultures in the Saharan area and in North Africa, and the sex specificity is exactly the same. You could even look at studies from ancient Greece where they are depicting on funeral monuments little boys and little girls. Little boys are shown with the trucks and the wheels, and little girls are shown with the dolls. So all of this cumulative evidence suggests that there might be some biological factors that come into play, in this case, in terms of explaining our toy preferences. But I put up this example to show you how we could cull data from many, many different sources in constructing an argument. It's not just one datum that either falsifies or proves the point. You build this nomological network in making your case. All right, moving on. So one of the things that I do in much of my work, in several of my books, is that I argue that much of consumption can be mapped onto one of 4 key Darwinian modules: the survival module, the mating module, kin selection, and reciprocity. And I'll give examples that fall into each of these, okay, in a second. So here's an example from the survival module. So if you take, for example, the hummingbird in the top photo, it has such a fast metabolic rate that it has to eat something like 2 to 3 times its body weight per day. Otherwise, it will starve. Well, regrettably, humans don't quite have the same metabolic rate, yet we still have quite a strong penchant to gorge and hoard foods, as in a buffet and so on. And so this idea of succumbing to variety is something that is very, very part of our makeup. So here's a great study that was, a couple of studies that were done that I sort of explain in an evolutionary perspective. So in this study, you take unicolored M&Ms in a one bowl, or you put multicolored M&Ms, exact same number of M&Ms. The colorant is odorless and tasteless, so objectively, there is no reason for you to prefer the colored M&Ms. And yet, if you ask people to eat from one of the 2 bowls, they end up eating a lot more from the multicolored M&M bowl, precisely because I argue it is tricking my visual system to adhere to this desire for variety seeking. A slightly different manifestation of exactly the same phenomenon, you could take one form of pasta, or you could cut it into multi-form pasta. The pasta doesn't change, it's the exact same pasta. People will eat a lot more from the multi-form pasta than they will from the singular form pasta. So that would be an example of how we succumb to the variety effect and what might be some evolutionary reasons for that. Let me skip this one. This basically says that we are very drawn to fatty foods for perhaps obvious reasons to this room. I love to use this example because it demonstrates how cultural heterogeneity is also within the purview of evolutionary theory. It's not just that evolutionary psychologists study human universals. They do that, and it's certainly a very valuable endeavor. But they also, at times, explain why cultures might differ from one another. So, example, how much meat does a culinary tradition have? Some cultures have a lot of meat in their cuisine. Others are a lot more vegetable-based. How much salt does a culture consume? How much spices does it use in the preparations of its food, right? So Mexican food is more spicy than Swedish food. How much pickling is used? Well, so what Paul Sherman and his colleagues did, a field which he coined Darwinian gastronomy, he basically argued that what determines all of these different culinary traditions is the ambient temperature of those cultures. So in hot climates, where you're likely to have much greater pathogenic density, well, then you will evolve culinary traditions that can serve as antimicrobial solution to these food pathogens. So unlike what a cultural psychologist would do, which is simply revel at identifying the difference. Malaysians do it this way, the French do it that way, good night, we're done. What an evolutionary psychologist would do is then ask the next logical question. Well, to the extent that these cultural differences exist, might there be a biological reason that drove that particular difference? Let's move on to mating. There's a lot of stuff I have to cover. So one of the things that I do with mating is I argue that in the same way that countless species engage in sexual signaling, so I have here the classic example, but there are many others. The peacock is exhibiting his large tail, the iridescent colors, the symmetry of the patterns. All of these are costly signals. It's quite burdensome for him to carry such a tail to avoid predators and so on. It makes him more conspicuous to see by predators. And so he's showing off his tail. Well, I argue that consumers engage in similar forms of this type of lecking behavior, this kind of sexual signaling. Now, men and women will use different products to ameliorate their position in the mating market, but we all do it. So in a study that I did a few years ago, which, as you might expect when I explain it, had received quite a bit of attention, I had ran a study with one of my former graduate students where we rented a Porsche and then got also a beaten-up old car, and we had young males come to the lab. And this wasn't a study like you would find often in psychology. Imagine doing this. We actually had the young men drive both cars downtown Montreal on a Friday, on a weekend, where everybody could see you, bumper to bumper, so you can't drive fast. It's like a parking lot. Or on a semi-deserted highway. And after each condition, we collected salivary assays so that we could then measure their fluctuating rates of testosterone. And we had hypothesized that, of course, you put the young males in the Porsche, their testosterone should go up. You put them in the beaten-up car, it should go down. And we thought that that endocrinological response would be greater in the public setting. If everybody can see that I'm a winner or not, it'll matter more if everybody can see me or not. To our surprise, we found that you put a young man in a Porsche, irrespective of whether many people see him or not, his testosterone levels shoot up. And contrary to what a reviewer had mentioned during our attempt to publish the paper, he thought, well, how do you know that that's just not because he's driving fast? Well, first, that could also be linked to cortisol, not necessarily to testosterone. But secondly, in downtown Montreal, you're actually exactly controlling for that. It's bumper to bumper. You can't drive fast. It's complete traffic. And so you're completely removing that possibility. The testosterone is going up simply because you are infusing me with this very high social status. Here are some other studies. These are not studies that I've done, but that speak to the same reality. This is a study done by some British psychologists where they take the exact same man and either put him in a very cheap Ford Fiesta, apologies to anybody who might own a Ford Fiesta here, or in a silver Bentley, and in the top case, they ask women to rate the physical attractiveness. It's not how desirable is he as a mate. Well, his physical attractiveness shouldn't change. I mean, his face is his face, whether he's sitting in one car or in another. And then you do the same thing with women. Well, the women manipulation doesn't work on men. In other words, men don't evaluate the woman as more or less beautiful as a function of whether she's sitting in one car or the other. Women, on the other hand, view the guy on the right as Brad Pitt and the guy on the left as George Costanza from Seinfeld. Okay? Now, I can promise you that I could run this study in 55 different cultures, and I won't get a reversal of that effect. I haven't done it, but I can pretty safely assume that to the extent that we're going to pick up that sex effect, it's going to happen with that directionality. Here's a study that I haven't yet published, but I did with one of my former graduate students. The idea of this study came to me. I was writing a Psychology Today article on this great study that was done, I think, in the late 60s, where you basically have a guy come into a room, like this room, and let's say Professor Wilson would introduce me either as, of different status. He's just an unknown assistant professor, he's a somewhat known, or he's a very famous, blah, blah. And then I leave the room, and then later you're asked ostensibly some questions, one of which is, how tall am I? And it turns out that the exact same guy, depending on how he was ascribed different social status, will be perceived as taller. So by being higher status, I'm actually viewed as taller. This is why I look like 6'4" for most of you. So, sorry, it's bad when you laugh at your own jokes. So in this study, basically what we did is I said, well, let's see if I could test this in a consumer setting. So we created these two online dating profiles. It's exactly the same profile, except that in one version, the guy says, oh, my favorite possession that I own that I'm very proud of is my car. In one version, it's fancy Porsche, and another version it's not. And later you ask people exactly the same thing. Well, I won't show you the stats and so on, but the bottom line is, when men evaluate this guy, this is a very important point. When he's in the Porsche, what do you think they do to his height? They shrink it. He becomes shorter. When women evaluate the guy, when he's in the Porsche, he becomes taller, right? So intrasexual rivalry, I'm intimidated by other men who may have higher social status than me, to the extent that height is a desirable cue in men. Well, if I see a guy in a Porsche, oh, who's that little shrimp? He must have been some short guy, right? On the other hand, when women see that guy, oh, no, I think he was a tall, elegant guy, okay? So again, it would have been difficult to even think about testing this idea were we not certainly aware of some of these sexual dynamics. I'll skip some of the details. Almost the same principle done by one of the authors of the previous study. You take the same woman, you either put her in a sort of banal apartment or in a very sort of high-status luxury apartment. You do the same thing with a man, and then you ask opposite sex ratings. Men don't care about the apartment that the woman is in. Women profoundly care about the apartment that the guy is in. There is no culture that you'll ever uncover where that sex specificity will go the opposite way. I promise you. Since we're talking so far about male sexual signaling, but I don't want to leave out, of course, the fact that women engage also in sexual signaling, although they might use, as I said before, different avenues for that sexual signaling. So here's an example of a study that I did with one of my recently graduated doctoral students, Eric Stenstrom, where we tracked every conceivable behavior of women across 35 contiguous days. And we chose 35 days because the average length of a menstrual cycle is 28 days. And so we wanted to overshoot by at least a week so that we could cover the variation across women in terms of their cycles. And so the two things that we reported in this paper were beautification behaviors, wearing makeup, wearing high heels, dressing in a sexy, scantily clad way across the menstrual cycle. And also we looked at food-related issues. How much do you desire high-calorie foods? How much do you spend on foods across your menstrual cycle? I'll just talk here about the beautification part. Well, as many of you could probably predict, during the maximally fertile phase of the menstrual cycle, in the ovulatory phase, this is when women engage in the greatest amount of sexual signaling. Now here, this doesn't mean that women are doing this consciously, right? It's not as though you're plotting all of your hormonal fluctuations. Oh, gee, look, my progesterone is here, my luteinizing hormone is there, let me dress with a miniskirt. But you're endowed with certain evolved mechanisms that would make it more or less likely to want to beautify yourself. You feel more or less bloated, you feel higher or lower self-esteem, you feel more or less sexy, and then that would promote either sexual signaling or not. So again, this would have been a very difficult finding to uncover, let alone even ask, were we not aware of some of these physiological forces. This is a study that actually just came out earlier this past spring, again with one of my former doctoral students. Since we're talking about mating, let me mention it very, very briefly. The study itself, the set of studies is quite intricate, but let me give you the punchline. So there's something called the framing effect that Kahneman and Tversky famously talked about many years ago. Loosely put, it goes something like this. If I tell you that a hamburger is 90% fat-free, it is exactly the same as telling you that the hamburger is 10% fat, right? I mean, they're identical statements, right? Yet, contrary to sort of classical economic theory, if I ask you to try the hamburger when it's framed one way, or if I ask you to try the hamburger when it's framed the other way, you arrive to completely different perceptions. If I tell you that 3 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste, it's the exact same thing as telling you that 2 out of 5 don't recommend it. Yet people have completely different understandings of the toothpaste or perceptions of the toothpaste. So we wanted to test this idea in the context of mate choice. And so my thinking was that if you ask men and women to evaluate mates as how desirable it is for you to go out with them on a date, and you frame the information about them either positively or negatively, men and women would be differentially likely to succumb to this manipulation. How would we test this? If I tell you that the guy you're going to go out with, 7 out of 10 of his acquaintances think that he's intelligent. That's exactly like saying that 3 out of 10 don't think that he's intelligent. Yes? Now, if I frame it positively, you'll end up with maybe different evaluations than if I frame it negatively. We predicted and found that women were much more likely to succumb to the framing effect, specifically in the context of mate choice. And the reason is simple. Negative information looms much larger in the psyche of women exactly in the context of mate choice. This doesn't generalize to car choice and apartment choice and toothpaste choice. In the context of mate choice, an evolutionarily important problem, we would expect that there is an asymmetry to either the positively or negatively valenced information. And that's exactly what we got. Okay, so this shows you how you could marry, in this case, behavioral decision theory and an evolutionary lens. Moving to, remember I mentioned there is survival module, kin selection, mating module, kin selection, and reciprocity. So one of the ways where I study these last 2 modules is in the context of gift giving, because gift giving is a way by which we form, solidify bonds of reciprocity, right? I invite you to when it's your birthday for dinner, with the expectation that you might reciprocate when it's my birthday. And so gift giving, we studied it in several ways. Let me just mention very quickly one way. So we had data from Israeli weddings where the bride and groom had kept a diary of all the people that gave monetary gifts and the amount that they gave. So Aunt Hannah gave $180, Uncle Bob gave $200, and so on. And we had 30 such weddings. We had data from 30 such weddings. So we tested 2 things. And again, both of these things would have been difficult to think of if you weren't coming from an evolutionary perspective. Number one, I mean, you don't have to worry about all the histograms. Let me give you the punchline. People are very well calibrated in terms of the amount that they pay for a gift as a function of the genetic relatedness between them and the recipient. Or more simply put, if you're a first cousin, you're likely to give a bigger sum than if you're a second cousin. If you're a brother, you're likely to give more money than if you're a first cousin, and so on. So that we established. Now that you could say, well, I could have probably predicted that even if I knew nothing about evolutionary theory. And fair enough. The next finding, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to come up with if you didn't understand some of the intricacies. So if you look now, for example, at your grandparents on average share 1/4 of their genes with you. It's called the genetic relatedness coefficient is 0.25. So if you only looked at genetic relatedness, all of your 4 grandparents are equally vested in you. But if you now add a second component, which is known as genetic assuredness, well, your maternal grandmother is assured of her genetic lineage to you. There is no such thing as maternity uncertainty. Your paternal grandfather has 2 generations of paternal uncertainty. We never know who the father is, right? We didn't evolve with DNA paternity testing with the Maury Povich show, right? And so therefore, we would expect that the maternal side of the bride and groom might give larger gifts than the paternal side, in an otherwise quite patriarchal context of the Middle East. And this is exactly what we found. Just the bar, the bigger bar basically says that the maternal side of the bride and groom give larger gifts than the paternal side. So that particular parsing of this gift-giving behavior would have been quite difficult to even posit where you're not coming from an evolutionary perspective. Moving on. If some of you have seen me, some of you might have seen me give this anecdote in other contexts, maybe in other talks, or maybe not. Even if you've seen it, I think it's worth hearing it again. I like to use this personal anecdote because so we're talking about paternity uncertainty. This relates about paternity uncertainty. There are so many things that happen in a daily setting where you could tie it to some evolutionary phenomenon. And so here is my attempt to link one such reality from my personal life. So when our first daughter was in utero, when my wife was carrying our daughter, of course, everybody, all parents get their first trimester ultrasound photos, the first one. oftentimes you post it proudly on the fridge. You're happy that you have this child that's going to come soon. And so this is the exact photo. I mean, these are the actual in utero photos of our daughter, Luna. Now, if you look at those photos objectively, they could be the photos of an extraterrestrial, of an amoeba, of a baby Joey, of endless other possibilities. Yet my mother-in-law was able to look at this photo and say, "Oh my God, Gad, the baby looks exactly like you." Now, why do I say this? Because right away as she said this, I said, "Oh my God, she's trying to assuage my fears of paternity uncertainty," right? Now, we know that in countless cultures, when a baby is born, the families, and especially the mother's family, will consistently reaffirm that the newborn looks like the father. But this is the first instance of that phenomenon in utero. And so I've told my daughter that forevermore she'll be famous in the annals of science for this. I should probably publish this story somewhere. So this is an example of how you could take a personal story that otherwise might go completely unnoticed and then link it to some actually quite a profound reality about our human minds. So what has been the historical reactions of marketing scholars to my work? These are different ways to capture that. Now, the good news is that they're coming around, but the reality is that for probably the first 10 years or so of my endeavor, I was pretty much the lone wolf at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and consumer behavior. And so I was viewed as the heretical guy. Like, what does biology have to do with consumer behavior? This makes no sense. And we'll see now how we might be able to tackle some of those obstacles. I don't want to read, some of these quotes are fantastic, but they're a bit too long. But let me just read the first line of the first quote, and then I'll read some of the other ones. So this was actually from a reviewer. I was talking about sex differences in this paper, sex differences in mate search, the extent to which men and women search for information before they commit to a mate choice. And so this reviewer said, this underlying theory, moreover, is grounded more in biology than in psychology, thereby implicating other blah, blah, blah. Basically, what this reviewer is saying, what does this have to do with psychology? It's all biology. Already, that's quite telling, because that's suggesting that somehow our psychology resides outside of our biology, right? Which is quite a profoundly silly position to take, right? Here's another one sent by a librarian from, I think, University of Toronto, when she had read the study that I mentioned earlier with the menstrual cycle, the fact that women beautify themselves more during the maximally fertile phase. She writes to me, perhaps you have not noticed that this is highly problematic contention, at least as it is still used as a defense for rapists. So what kind of Nazi monster must you be to do this research? Don't you know that this research that you're doing is going to be used by rapists to get off from their criminal act? Which, of course, I don't quite see the link. But it's quite astonishing that somebody could actually make that argument. There's something inherently sinister about evolutionary psychology because somebody might misuse it. So please don't do this research. It's dangerous. Here's another one who said, for our purposes, we might simply note that right from the start, Saad is looking to compare us with monkeys. So when I'm talking about homologies or analogies between consumers and other species, the mere fact that I am comparing some phenomenon in terms of how humans do it to some other species, that was offensive. I mean, what do you think? We're just monkeys? Okay? And so that's called, we discussed it earlier, David and I, it's called the human reticence effect. The idea that, sure, evolution might apply to explain the behavior of countless species, but it stops for humans. It doesn't apply to humans. A few more good quotes. This one, integrating evolutionary psychology with consumer psychology seems to be such a broad topic, especially within the generally accepted areas of studies for consumer psychology, as to be, in this case, a non-topic. I don't know what that means. This next guy says, well, you know, evolutionary theory is just a bunch of hand-waving, right? It's just a bunch of just-so storytelling. So we are beyond the point where it is acceptable to say, take it on faith. Because all we do as evolutionists, we just say, hey, just trust me, take it on faith. I've got no data to support what I'm saying, right? I mean, that's the general view. And then this is actually from an editor of a major psychology journal where we got into a pretty somewhat spicy back and forth by email, where she said, because I said to her, well, perhaps the fact that you are a staunch feminist might have something to do with your reticence to evolutionary psychology, to which she answered, my issue with ET, evolutionary theory, not even evolutionary psychology, just evolution. So my issue with evolution comes from being a scientist, not a feminist, sick, misspelled. It's a just-so story that is rarely directly tested, much less compared to other explanations. I've actually heard that very often. Evolution is not really science. It doesn't meet the epistemological requirements for science. Darwin, you are a schmuck, boy. It's all BS, whatever you said. But she knows better. She does real science. So let me discuss how we would build, because remember, some of these quotes here are saying, well, you take it on faith, it's all just so storytelling. Let me give you examples of how evolutionary psychologists actually go about building these cumulative sources of evidence, or what are called nomological networks of evidence. So let's take the classic waist-to-hip ratio. So some of you have heard the idea that men and women have a preferred hip-to-waist ratio in opposite sex. Women prefer men roughly with a hip-to-waist ratio of 0.9, and men prefer a waist-to-hip ratio of roughly 0.7, with some cultural input. So depending on the culture, that could be slightly modulated. But the idea is that men, on average, prefer the hourglass figure. Okay, well, then you would say, well, why would that be? Well, it turns out that that figure is correlated to nubility and fertility and lack of disease. Now, do we just make that up, or has that been tested? Well, it's been tested. And women who have that particular shape are more likely to be fertile, are less likely to have diseases, are more likely to be younger. So that wasn't a just-so story. There is an epidemiological study that you could do to test this exact idea. So now let's test the preference of 0.7. Let's see if it's just a bunch of just-so storytelling, hand-waving. Well, you could take the top one, you could take these figurines and apply them in many different cultures, as has been done, and you find that on average, in quite different societies, men do prefer the 0.7. There is no culture that's been uncovered where the Michael Phelps body type is the preferred body type that men have towards women. If you find such a culture, please email me. I'll make you very famous. You could look at cultural artifacts spanning thousands of years from India, Africa, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, so statues, for example, and calculate their waist-to-hip ratio, and then you find that, not always, but as an average, it ends up being 0.7. I did a study a few years ago where I did a content analysis of the waist-to-hip ratios of online female escorts, so sex workers who are advertising their services online across 48 different countries. One of the beauties of the internet is that it allows you to collect data very quickly, which we couldn't do 20 years ago. So across 48 countries, you're able to code, because the women usually will say, my name is so-and-so, I'm this age, I'm this weight, here are my measurements. Well, what do you think the average waist-to-hip ratio was? I won't go through all of them, but let me mention another, the kicker. You could take congenitally blind men. Did you hear what I just said? Congenitally blind men. They've never had the gift of sight. So they couldn't have been socialized by sexist Elle magazine and by the big patriarchy on Madison Avenue. Yet, when you ask them to evaluate tactily, haptically, different mannequins, they choose the 0.7 mannequin as the preferred one. Does all of this evidence suggest to you that it's just hand-waving, just so storytelling? I don't know other fields that collect that much data to test a single point, which is, do men prefer 0.7? So the people who are levying those accusations are either breathtakingly ignorant of the field or deeply intellectually dishonest. There is no other possibility. Let me skip this one. I wish maybe I had a bit more time. It deals, well, maybe I have a bit of time. So here's another example of how you build this kind of nomological network. So there's a field called adaptive memory, which looks at how our memory system would have evolved to solve evolutionarily relevant problems, right? Which is something that typically cognitive psychologists don't study. So cognitive psychologists can have a very, very productive career and never mention the word biology or evolution, right? They don't study really sort of the adaptive forces that would have led to us having certain memory biases. So I culled these for an article that I'm currently writing for Journal of Marketing Research. So let me just mention a few examples on how you could start building a coherent theoretical narrative about how our memory might have evolved to do certain things. So if you take faces of people and show them to subjects, and then put a marker on each face as being either a cheater or not, and then you ask people to recall those faces, what do you think happens? People recall much more the faces of the cheaters. Now, it doesn't take a terribly sort of sophisticated functionalist argument to understand why that might be the case. To the extent that we navigate in social networks, it would make sense for me to know that she's a cheater. She's a cheater who won't reciprocate. He won't renege on our contract, and so on and so forth. So our memory bias is predisposed to remember certain things more than others. Let me mention a few others. So there's greater spatial recall of high-calorie foods by people. So if you kind of have them navigate through a space where there are different food sources, they will tend to remember the location of high-calorie foods more than low-calorie foods. So again, suggesting that there is a bias towards remembering certain things more than others. I won't mention all of it. Here's another one just very, very quickly. So men are much more likely to recall status products after they've been primed with a photo of a beautiful woman. So what you do is you prime men with photos of beautiful women, then you give them a bunch of products to view, and then you ask them later to recall products. They will recall the sexual signaling products a lot more after they've been primed with the image of a sexy woman, because they've been put in the mating prime. So I won't go through all these, but the bottom line is this is a way by which you could start studying our memory system, but by asking the question, why would our memory have evolved to solve certain problems better than others? And again, there are great opportunities in consumer psychology to apply these things, but nobody, very few people do it. So I mentioned this quote earlier to David when we were chatting. This next quote I love to use in many of my talks. I've even mentioned it in one of my books because it really serves as an autobiography of my career. Basically, it goes something like this. J.B.S. Haldane was a famous evolutionary geneticist who was also a very quotable guy. He had many great quips, kind of like a T.S. Eliot guy. And this one I love because, as I said, it really captures my reality over the past 20 years. He argued that there are 4 stages that scientists go through before they accept a radically new idea that really challenges their paradigm. So stage 1, this is verbatim. So I suppose the process of acceptance will pass through the usual 4 stages. Stage 1, this is worthless nonsense. Now think back about some of the quotes I put up earlier. They're exactly that. I used to receive such emails. Okay? This is worthless nonsense. Then as the evidence starts to build, well, this is an interesting but perverse point of view. As more evidence comes in, well, this is true but quite unimportant. I mean, who cares? How would you apply this? Okay? And then once the paradigmatic walls fall, oh, I always said so. I always thought your work was great, right? Now, the misfortune of some of those people is that I've kept their emails when they sent me 10 years ago when they were at stage 1 and told me that all that I'm talking about is a bunch of BS. But now they're inviting me to speak at their school. So I said, well, what happened? How come I went from being the utmost of BSer to actually being interesting now? Well, because that's how science is. It's autocorrective. That which was scorned and laughed at becomes normal science. So what are some of the theoretical epistemological and methodological benefits of adopting an evolutionary framework. So let me mention some of these. I'll mention them in greater details in a second. Greater consilience. This is a very important word. Consilience refers to unity of knowledge. Some fields are very consilient. They have organized trees of knowledge. Physics, chemistry, biology are consilient. Sociology, postmodernism, not so much. Okay? And so one of the things that evolutionary theory allows you to do, certainly within the behavioral sciences, if not originally in biology, is that it allows you to have more organized frameworks. Your knowledge is organized into a coherent tree of knowledge. It allows you to have more complete explanations because you tackle problems at both the proximate and ultimate levels. It offers you a heuristic for generating novel hypotheses that you would have been unable to generate were you not coming from an evolutionary perspective. Many of the studies that I mentioned would have been very difficult for me to think of were I not coming from an evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary psychology also engenders methodological pluralism. If you just look at my scientific career, I haven't been tied to a particular paradigm or a methodology. Some studies I've done were surveys, others were experiments, others were field experiments, others were content analysis. I've used twins registries. I've collected salivary assays to measure testosterone. I've done female hormones. So I've gone anywhere where there was an interesting problem for me to tackle. I wasn't methodologically fixated. And I think that came in part because I was evolutionarily informed. There's greater interdisciplinarity that is afforded by evolutionary psychology. By definition, the fact that David and I can sit together, although we come from very, very different academic backgrounds, yet today we could speak on exactly the same sets of issues that interest us both. He's in a biology department, I'm in a business school. And so that rapprochement that happens between departments is much more likely to occur if you are adopting an evolutionary framework. Evolutionary psychology also allows you to have an ethos of conceptual replication. Replications are a foundational tenet of the scientific method, yet if you look at how often findings are replicated in the behavioral sciences, it's abysmal. So for example, in psychology, there was a recent study, there's 1.2% replication. In marketing, it's almost the same. So only about 1% of the findings that are ever documented in the literature are ever replicated. Well, that's not what happens in physics or chemistry or biology. And so evolutionary theory allows you this greater capacity to replicate findings. For example, the facial symmetry effect has been replicated ad nauseum. The menstrual cycle ovulatory effect has now been replicated by many, many different groups of people in many different ways, precisely because you work on these big, important problems that many people want to nail down. And the other thing that evolutionary psychology allows you to do is lesser reliance on what's called the weird bias, which refers to the use of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic samples, the standard sort of undergraduate student in a psychology class. Well, it's quite ironic that other psychologists will accuse evolutionary psychologists of all of these biases, but actually evolutionary psychologists are much less likely to commit this bias, precisely because they do go to other cultures. They do go to closed societies in the Amazon and study their mating preferences. So if anything, evolutionary psychologists are profoundly more open to the study of multiple cultures. So I won't go through all of, I kind of said many of these things. Here's an example, for example, of interdisciplinarity I was mentioning earlier. If you look at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society group, these are some of this is the main conference for evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary behavioral scientists. Look at the number of fields that are covered: psychology, anthropology, biology, literature, medicine, history, political science, on and on. All of these different people come to this conference because they all wish to apply evolutionary theory within their individual fields. So it shows you the amount of interdisciplinarity there is. On the other hand, if you go to the #1 consumer psychology conference or consumer research conference, it's almost singularly housed by marketing scholars. But why should that be? I mean, tons of people should be interested in consumer behavior. Physicians should be interested in consumer behavior. Design engineers should be interested in consumer behavior. How do you design optimal products? Yet you don't see that. Only consumer researchers come to consumer conferences. That's certainly not the case with evolutionary theory. So a few additional quotes to think about, and then I'll wrap it up. So this is actually quoted, this is by Richard Nisbett, a famous psychologist. He said, "Not every psychologist will be an evolutionary psychologist, but every psychologist will be aware of the perspective and will have to address its explanations and constraints in his or her own work." And then David Barish said, "I am confident that the evolutionary part will eventually be seen as redundant, since in the future all psychology, just like all biology today, will be known to be evolutionary. It cannot be anything else." Okay? And so I'll use as a final thing, this is the exact same slide as I did in 2005, except that these books weren't shamelessly plugged then because I hadn't written all these books yet in 2005. But in 2005, I ended my talk here at EVOS by quoting the famous aphorism by Dobzhansky, who said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And of course, I propose that nothing in consumer behavior or in business in general makes sense except in the light of evolution. Thank you very much. Well,
So we have some time for questions, and then we'll have a few questions, and then of course we'll have a little break and go to your questions. Please. When you talk a lot about all these slides, but you usually talk much about the effects of them. So my question to you is, do you describe these slides as major factors that really influence a lot of human behavior, or as more subtle effects that are kind of objectively?
what do you mean by bias? Give me an example of a bias. The results, not the bias. I mean, you mean the effect, the phenomenon. Okay? So go on. So what is the effect size of that phenomenon? I mean, it depends on each study. I can't tell you off the top of my head what each effect size was. I mean, strong enough that they were statistically significant, that they went through a very, very... Yeah. Yes. I'm not following the question.
So take the body height was. How many inches? Was it a fraction of an inch?
Well, I mean, I can't, off the top of my head, tell you what was the number of inches that was different. What I can tell you is that we did an analysis, and it was statistically significant. In some cases, you report effect sizes because the journal's mandated, and others you don't. But, I mean, that's looking at the tree rather than the big forest. The net story is that there are certain phenomena that are within the purview of evolutionary theory. Yeah. No, they have profound influence on decision making. Yes. Now, that doesn't, to say that they are strong and operative doesn't imply that they are within our conscious awareness. So, for example, we all breathe in this room, and I think we can probably all agree that there must have been some adaptive mechanism by which we evolved our capacity to breathe. That doesn't mean that we are consciously aware of that mechanism or that we could explain the ultimate explanation of how we evolved, but yet we know that it's there. And so many of these mechanisms are hidden forces that shape our behavior, even though most of us go about our daily lives completely oblivious as to what those forces are. Right, so in general, in the luteal phase, in the most non-fertile phase, this is where the greatest amount of food-related pursuits were prominent, whether it be in terms of how much money they spent, how much they thought about high-calorie foods, how much they desired high. So we had many different metrics in the luteal phase. So basically, you could think of it this way. There are different Darwinian pulls that are important, but they are differentially important one takes precedence over the other depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle. So it's not that mating is completely shut down at a luteal phase, but during the fertile phase is where mating signals really take precedence, and food in the luteal phase. Sexual orientation, you mean? I'm certainly not able to definitively make that statement, no. So I wouldn't be able to say. I mean, it's certainly an open hypothesis that one can test. But what I can certainly say is that there is research that has linked some markers, for example, digit ratio, as I mentioned, to sexual orientation. So it is conceivable that there is some sort of link there, but I certainly haven't seen that. Yes?
Yes, and then the person in back. Yep.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it comes from the conflation of the idea that if we're going to create equality under the law for men and women, that you are best able to achieve that if you somehow assume that we are biologically indistinguishable. And that's a silly position to take. No liberal person thinks that men and women should not be equal under the law, but we could be fully equal under the law while recognizing that we are not indistinguishable creatures. So I think it comes from a good place where people think that in order to eradicate the sexist status quo, we need to eradicate the possibility that there might be sexual dimorphism that exists between the two sexes. By arguing that short of our genitalia, everything is a social construction, that makes it easier to combat sexism. And that's just silly.
And then the person behind, yep.
So you're saying, based on feedback I received that was critical, did that serve as input to future studies that I did? I mean, I can answer that in a slightly different way. So the studies that I mentioned today that dealt with hormones, whether it be the menstrual cycle one or the testosterone one, I picked those research questions in part because I knew that it would make it more difficult for social constructivists to argue, oh, it's just due to learning, it's all due to cultural indoctrination, because it's difficult to argue that, you know, these fluctuating hormones that affect a woman's behavior throughout her menstrual cycle is just due to cultural indoctrination. So in that sense, I've at times tried to pick topics that simply made it more difficult for those who would erect those obstacles to do so.
Just a couple more, and then we're going to stop, and then we'll start to go on. So, Ben and Mark.
Our question was, you were talking about, you mentioned over and over again that you wouldn't expect, with the car example, that any other culture on Earth would have the reverse gender norm. Would you expect that if it was a truly matriarchal society, something along those lines, where women truly were in equal power, and I mean, in terms of picking everything,
Yes.
you know, would you expect that the gender norms would then be equal?
No. So let me give you an example of that, not quite in the sense of doing it with a matriarchal society, but take, for example, women in the West who are extremely powerful, billionaire women, head CEO, Fortune 500 CEOs. What do you think happens to their mating preference? So we know, for example, that women around the world, one of the key metrics that they look for is high social status. Social status might be defined differently across cultures. In one culture, it might be the number of cattle heads I own. In another, it might be whether I own a Porsche or have a degree from Harvard. But in all cultures, women prefer a guy who has cues that link to social status. There's no culture where women say, give me a lazy, submissive, whiny, high-pitched, nasal, pear-shaped guy who's unemployed. My God, that's sexy. Let's have sex. Okay? If you find that culture, please let me know. I'll make you famous. So those women who are very, very powerful, what do you think happens to their mating preferences? You might think, well, now that they are billionaires, they don't need to insist on men who have high status. But what happens to their preferences? They are even more insistent that the man that they choose be of higher status. So that suggests that it's not, there isn't going to be some reality that somehow eradicates these basal mating preferences. At least I don't think so.
Okay, so let's see, actually, who was, so one more and then we'll talk for a minute.
I think it's what you said about how women are just going to go more attractive when the ring is on the neck.
Yes.
What would you say?
Right, so this is, I actually tried to, the gentleman, the guru of this red effect is a guy by the name of Elliott at the University of Rochester, actually. And so we tried to take this red effect paradigm in a consumer context, but our results were actually quite disappointing. So just for those of you who may not know, the red effect basically says that if you take, for example, a woman and you associate her to the red color, you put a red background, or you take the same woman with another color, and then you ask men to rate her on many dimensions, only on the dimensions that relate to physical attractiveness, sexuality, will the red effect yield an effect. In other words, on intelligence, the girl in red won't be perceived as more intelligent than the other color. But on, say, beauty or sexual desire, she will. The general argument, although it is a bit of a speculative one, admittedly so, is that red mimics certain sexual excitatory arousal stages that women would exhibit. So, for example, certain erogenous zones, if you are sexually aroused, become engorged, become reddened. And that's why, for example, makeup, in French, lipstick is rouge à lèvres, which basically means red on lipstick. It's the generic term for lipstick, precisely because the idea is that you redden your lips to mimic this sexual excitatory arousal response. You put red here exactly for that. You're flustered here. That's why a lot of sexual products, lingerie is red, red flowers, Valentine's associated with the color red. So I think that's the general argument. There's now actually some compelling evidence that it does operate across cultures, and it only operates on women who are in the reproductive window. If you do the red effect on postmenopausal women, you don't get the effect. So this is how you slowly start building, again, a nomological network that suggests that there is something to the red effect.
Great. Okay, well, let's end with that for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will recommence in just a few minutes.
Hi there. Hi there. Oh, nice to meet you. Did I happen to send you my email? I did. Okay.
I wasn't available.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I'm glad you came. Thank you so much for coming.
Are you all done? Did you want me to send this?
I think I'm okay, but maybe we can just erase the.